Every story has its collector. The tales of horror, of suffering, of despair, each one calls to me. And so, I add another to my collection. Welcome, dear listener, to the Vale of Nightmares. In this entry, we journey into a world overtaken by the earth itself. Brian, a Wasteland Porter, navigates a landscape where nature fights back and humanity struggles to survive. With the green dust poisoning the air and the greens hunting in the shadows, Brian's task is simple. Find supplies, survive another day. But the wasteland has a way of changing people, and as he ventures deeper into this new world, the line between man and monster begins to blur. Take a breath, adventurer, and let's see how long you can survive in this Chapter 1. The Beginning of the Green.
Brian had seen plenty of days worse than this. That wasn't saying much. This world was one of pain, decay, and the constant reminder that life wasn't what it used to be. But this was different. The air had a taste to it today, something thick like the world itself was holding its breath. It had started slowly, like all things do, with a whisper in the wind. At first, it was a strange, almost pleasant scent, a wildflower scent wafting through the cracks of the old world, slipping into the edges of the cities and forests. No one had thought much of it. After all, nature had a way of creeping back, of reclaiming what humanity had destroyed. But that was before the green dust. Brian had been one of the first to notice it, back when the earth was still fighting back with flowers and vines sprouting out of every corner. He'd never thought to stop and smell them, but on that fateful morning, when the dust started to settle on the abandoned streets, something about it made him pause. It was the whispering in the wind, the way it didn't feel like the air had moved naturally. The dust settled on his boots first. Then it moved to his face. The pollen, or whatever it was, slipped into his nostrils and throat, and for a second he thought it was just the dust of old-world decay. But it wasn't. No, that was the first sign. People had called them the greens when they started to change. Pale, rotting figures with moss and vines sprouting from their backs. At first, people thought it was just sickness. Maybe some kind of fungal infection or a chemical spill gone wrong. But the symptoms didn't add up. It was worse. Far worse. Brian had learned early on to trust his gut. And when he saw the first one, a twisted figure clawing at a broken door frame, its skin a sickly green, its eyes empty, staring out at him through the cracked window, he knew this was different. The greens spread by the same dust that had once brought them life. The poison of nature wasn't something they could fight. It wasn't like anything man-made. The air, thick and buzzing with something deadly, made the skin crawl even before the infection took hold. He'd heard of them attacking, of them spitting that cursed pollen onto anyone unlucky enough to be within range. If the explosion of green wasn't enough, it would be the dust, covering you, suffocating you, infecting you from the inside out. Brian, being a Wasteland Porter, had always been a survivor, but survival meant more than just dodging infected creatures and raiders. It meant dealing with the remnants of the world. The scattered communities. The desperate people still clinging to whatever scraps they could find. And the currency? That was what got him through it. Every mission, every run out into the wasteland brought him a step closer to safety, or so he thought. Today the winds carried something worse. He could feel it. He had a job. A delivery. Supplies to a community up north, but that wasn't his main concern right now. He needed to get his hands on a proper rebreather. Without one, the pollen was death. No one had a way of knowing where the dust was thickest or where the greens had made their nests. A part of him wondered if this was how it all started, this sudden shift, this gradual change in the air, the dust, the greens. Were the communities already lost? Would this be his last delivery? He couldn't afford to think like that. Not yet. But the dread gnawed at his stomach as he grabbed the pack, securing his old gas mask tightly before heading out of his small, makeshift home. It was time for another run.
Chapter 2: The Wasteland's Breath.
The wasteland had never felt so alive. Brian could feel it in the air, thick and heavy as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The wind howled in strange gusts, making the tall, twisted trees creak and groan as if protesting their existence. He adjusted the straps on his backpack, the weight of his gear familiar but no less burdensome. As he walked through the ruins of a long-abandoned city, his eyes scanned the horizon. The dust from the Earth's resurgence swirled, carried by the unnatural winds. A faint smell of decay lingered in the air, the sickly sweetness of something rotten just out of sight. He had learned to trust his senses, to pay attention to the subtle shifts in the world around him. Today felt different. Something about it felt wrong, as though the earth itself was watching him, waiting. It had been weeks since he'd last encountered a green, but Brian knew better than to let his guard down. He had heard the rumors, people disappearing, whispers of whole communities falling silent. The greens, those grotesque plant-like creatures, didn't just attack. They spread like a plague, and no one was immune. The faint creak of branches overhead made him pause. He scanned the sky, but the clouds were thick, swirling in unnatural patterns. The world was quieter than it had been, too quiet. That was the first sign. The birds had stopped singing, and the wind had died down in a way that made his skin crawl. He pulled his rebreather mask into place, securing the straps tightly over his face. It felt like a second skin now, something he'd become too accustomed to. But it wasn't just for the green pollen. He knew that the mask was a shield against more than just the air. It was his protection from the sickness, from the growing plague that was threatening to wipe out what little humanity remained. Brian checked his gun, a hand-me-down from a time before the world fell apart. The metal was scratched, battered, but it still held strong. He hoped he wouldn't need it, but that hope was quickly fading as he approached the outskirts of a ruined village. The buildings were crumbling, their once grand facades now hollowed out and overgrown with thick vines. There was no sound, no voices, no movement, nothing but the eerie hum of the earth's strange rebirth. He stepped lightly, his boots crunching on the dry ground, and paused at the entrance to what had once been a small market square. The distant rustling of leaves caught his attention, and he tensed, instinctively reaching for his weapon. Then from the shadows he saw it. A shape, too still to be human, too twisted to be anything but a nightmare. The creature stood in the center of the market, its back hunched, covered in dark, rotting green vines that seemed to pulse with an unnatural life. The face was the worst part, pale, sickly, with dark hollow eyes that stared directly at him, unblinking, unfeeling. The green. It turned its head slowly as if sensing his presence, its mouth stretching into a grotesque grin. Brian's heart pounded in his chest, his breath quickening as he stepped back, his instincts screaming at him to flee. But he knew that wasn't an option. Not anymore. The green lifted its hand, its fingers long and gnarled, covered in rough, bark-like skin. And then, without warning, it opened its mouth and let out a low, guttural hiss, just before spitting a thick cloud of green dust toward him. Brian's hand shoots up instinctively, his rebreather barely in place as the dust hits the air, swirling around him. His vision blurs and his pulse races.
And so, The Breath of the Earth Part 1 has come to a close. A journey through a world reshaped by the Green Plague, where survival is a cruel and constant battle. Has Brian made it one more day? You'll have to wait until the next chapter to find out. But in this wasteland, death is but a breath away. Until next we meet in this little digital haunt, remember, sometimes the land itself becomes the greatest enemy, and the monsters we face aren't always the ones we can see. Another story to add to the collection. Another soul, another fate. And yet, there are countless more waiting in the shadows.